At exactly 10:43 on a Sunday morning, 61-year-old Margaret Ellis heard the church doors open behind her. She almost didn't turn around. Someone arriving late wasn't unusual, but something made Margaret look. And the moment she did, the Bible resting on her lap slipped from her hands and landed on the floor. A woman stood at the back of the church. She looked older. Her hair was different. There were lines around her eyes Margaret had never seen before. 17 years had changed almost everything about her. But a mother doesn't forget her own child's face. It was Lauren, the daughter who had walked out of Margaret's home at 21 and disappeared from her life. The daughter Margaret had searched for, written letters to, cried over, prayed for every night. The daughter Margaret's husband had hoped to see one final time before he died. Lauren was standing less than 50 feet away. But she wasn't alone. Beside her stood a little girl, maybe 8 years old, holding tightly to Lauren's hand. Margaret stared at the child. Then the little girl looked up at Lauren and asked, "Mom, is that Grandma?" Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. "Grandma?" Lauren began crying. For 17 years, Margaret had prayed for one thing. "Lord, please bring my daughter home." But that Sunday morning, she was about to discover that God had brought home more than she had been praying for. And to understand why Lauren disappeared for 17 years, we have to go back to the night everything fell apart. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if stories of faith, hope, redemption, and restoration encourage you, subscribe to Stories of Faith and Grace and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss our next story. 17 years earlier, the Ellis home in Richmond, Virginia, was filled with shouting. That was unusual. Margaret and her husband, David, had spent 26 years building a peaceful home. Not a perfect home. There had been disagreements, bills, hard seasons. But faith was at the center of their family. Sunday mornings meant church. Dinner usually meant everyone around the same table. And when somebody was hurting, the family stayed close. Lauren was their only child. Growing up, she and Margaret had been inseparable. As a little girl, Lauren would sit on the kitchen counter while Margaret cooked. As a teenager, she would crawl into her parents' bed after a bad day and talk until midnight. David sometimes joked that Margaret knew what Lauren was thinking before Lauren did. Then Lauren turned 21, and she met Eric Dawson. Eric was 27, confident, charming. He made Lauren feel grown. Margaret tried to welcome him. She invited him to dinner. She asked about his work. She wanted to understand what her daughter saw in him. But gradually, Margaret noticed changes. Lauren stopped attending church. She missed family dinners. She began skipping classes. She withdrew from friends she'd known for years. And whenever Margaret expressed concern, Lauren became defensive. Then one afternoon, Margaret learned Lauren planned to leave college and move away with Eric. That frightened her. "You're almost finished with school," Margaret told her. "I can go back later. Why does everything have to happen right now?" Lauren heard judgment instead of concern. "You don't trust me." "That's not what I said." "You don't have to say it." For weeks, conversations became arguments. David tried to keep peace between them. Then one Friday night, Lauren came downstairs carrying a suitcase. Margaret froze. "What's that?" Lauren continued toward the door. "I'm leaving." David stood from the sofa. "Leaving for where?" "Eric's waiting." Margaret followed her. "Lauren, please. We can disagree without you walking away from your family." Lauren turned. "I am tired of living my life according to what you think is right. I'm your mother. I'm worried about you." "Exactly. You're always worried. Always questioning everything I do. Because I love you." "No, because you want to control me." Margaret's face changed. David stepped between them. Everybody calmed down. But Lauren reached for the door. Margaret's voice broke. "Please don't leave angry." Lauren stopped. For one moment, Margaret thought her daughter might put down the suitcase. Instead, Lauren looked at her mother and said, "I don't need you anymore." Then she walked outside. David followed her onto the porch. Margaret couldn't move. She heard a car door close, an engine start. Then the car disappeared down the street. Margaret stood in the hallway staring at the open doorway. She had no idea that 17 years would pass before Lauren walked through a doorway and saw her mother again. Margaret believed Lauren would return within a few days. She left Lauren's room untouched. Every time a car slowed outside, she looked through the window. Monday came. No Lauren. Margaret called. No answer. She sent a message. Then another. Finally, Lauren replied, "I'm fine. Please leave me alone." Margaret read those words repeatedly. David told her to give Lauren time. So they waited. A week became a month. Lauren stopped responding completely. Then her number changed. Margaret called friends. Most didn't know where she was. One said Lauren and Eric had moved to another city. That was all Margaret had. When Lauren's 22nd birthday arrived, Margaret baked her favorite chocolate cake. David found her decorating it in the kitchen. He didn't ask why. That evening, they ate dinner with Lauren's empty chair between them. Neither touched the cake. At Christmas, Margaret bought Lauren a gift. A cream-colored sweater. She wrapped it and placed it beneath the tree. Christmas morning passed. The gift remained. After New Year's, Margaret carried it upstairs and placed it in Lauren's closet. The following Christmas, she bought another gift. Then another the year after that. David once found her putting away another unopened box. How long are you going to keep doing this? Margaret looked at him. Until she comes home. David didn't argue. He simply helped her place it on the shelf. But Margaret's prayers changed. At first, she prayed, Lord, make Lauren come home. Then, Lord, help her understand we were trying to protect her. Eventually, Margaret stopped asking God to prove anyone right. Her prayer became simpler. Lord, wherever my daughter is, protect her. And please don't let her lose herself. Years passed. Margaret learned how to smile when people asked whether she had children. Yes, one daughter. Where does she live? I'm not sure. That answer never became easier. What Margaret couldn't see was that hundreds of miles away, Lauren's life was beginning to collapse. During her first year away, Lauren convinced herself she'd made the right decision. She and Eric rented a small apartment. Lauren found a job at a hotel front desk and abandoned her plans to finish college. She told herself she was free. But the excitement didn't last. Eric became increasingly distant. Money disappeared faster than Lauren could earn it. They argued about rent, work, where he'd been, who he'd been with. Some nights, Eric didn't return until morning. The things Margaret had worried about began happening one by one. And that made calling home harder. Because Lauren imagined the words, I told you so. Whether Margaret would actually say them didn't matter. Lauren had already created the conversation in her mind. 2 years after she left home, Eric walked away. There was no dramatic goodbye. He packed his things and told Lauren the relationship wasn't working. Then he left her with an apartment she couldn't afford. That night, Lauren sat on the kitchen floor with her phone in her hand. She still remembered her parents' home number. She dialed the first few digits, then stopped. She remembered her mother's face at the door. I don't need you anymore. Lauren deleted the numbers. She found a cheaper apartment, took extra shifts, moved again when she couldn't afford that one. Years passed. From the outside, Lauren looked independent. Inside, she carried a shame that grew heavier every year. Then her life changed again. Lauren became pregnant after another relationship ended. She was frightened, alone, and for the first time since leaving Richmond, she desperately wanted her mother. But after so many years, she told herself she'd lost the right to call. When her daughter was born, Lauren named her Abigail. The first night they were home, Lauren barely slept. She kept checking whether Abigail was breathing. When Abigail developed a fever months later, Lauren stayed beside her all night, terrified. At 3 a.m, holding a sleeping baby against her chest, Lauren suddenly remembered being 7 years old with pneumonia. Margaret had sat beside her bed all night. Lauren remembered waking to find her mother still there. She finally understood something she'd been too young and angry to understand before. Sometimes love worries. Sometimes love asks questions. Sometimes protection feels restrictive when you're desperate to prove you don't need protecting. Lauren looked at Abigail and thought about her mother, but she still didn't call. Now there was something else she would have to explain. A granddaughter Margaret didn't know existed. So another year passed. And another. Back in Richmond, Margaret and David were growing older. They knew nothing about Abigail. They didn't know where Lauren worked, whether she was married, whether she was healthy. But David never stopped believing she would return. Then, 12 years after Lauren left, David became ill. At first, doctors believed treatment would give him time. But his condition progressed quickly. Margaret became his caregiver. One evening, she sat beside his hospital bed while rain tapped against the window. David had barely spoken all afternoon. Then he opened his eyes. Margaret, I'm here. He looked toward the door. Any word from Lauren? Margaret lowered her eyes. No. David nodded. It was the answer he'd expected. I wish I'd seen her. Margaret gripped his hand. You will. But David knew. Don't promise me something you can't control. Margaret began crying. I should have found her. No, I should have tried harder. We tried. David squeezed her hand. Then he said something Margaret would remember years later. When she comes home, don't waste your time asking why she took so long. Margaret looked at him. David continued. She'll already know what she lost. 2 weeks later, David died. Lauren didn't know. At the funeral, Margaret kept looking toward the church entrance. Even then, part of her expected Lauren to appear. She didn't. That evening, Margaret returned to the house alone. David's shoes were beside the bed. His glasses were on the nightstand. His Bible was still open where he'd left it. Margaret walked into Lauren's old bedroom and sat down. For 12 years, she had tried to remain strong. That night, she couldn't. God, why? She cried until her chest hurt. We prayed. David prayed. Why couldn't he see her one more time? There was no answer. No sign. No explanation. Eventually, Margaret whispered, I don't understand you. Then, after a long silence, but I still trust you. From that day, her prayer changed again. Lord, I can't bring Lauren home. I can't change her heart. I can't fix 17 years. So reach her where I can't. Every Sunday, Margaret sat in church. Same section, same Bible. And sometimes, when the doors opened, she still looked. 5 more years passed. Abigail was now 8. She was curious, talkative, and constantly asking questions. One Saturday afternoon, she went into Lauren's bedroom looking for colored pencils. Instead, she found an old photograph at the back of a drawer. 3 people stood outside a house. A younger Lauren in the middle, Margaret on one side, David on the other. All 3 were smiling. Abigail carried it into the kitchen. Mom. Lauren turned from the sink. Her expression changed immediately. Where did you get that? Your drawer. Abigail pointed at Margaret. Who's she? Lauren stared at the photograph. My mother. Abigail smiled. My grandma. Lauren nodded. And him. My father. My grandpa. Lauren swallowed. Yes. Abigail looked at the picture again. Where are they? Virginia. Can we visit them? Lauren turned away. No. Why? It's complicated. Abigail frowned. Then she asked, Does Grandma know about me? Lauren's hand stopped. No. Abigail looked genuinely confused. Why doesn't your mom know you have a daughter? Lauren couldn't answer. Not in a way that made sense anymore. That night, after Abigail went to sleep, Lauren took the photograph into her bedroom. She sat on the floor. For years, she'd told herself she stayed away because Margaret wouldn't want her. But that wasn't the whole truth. Lauren was afraid. Afraid to admit she'd been wrong. Afraid to discover her parents had stopped loving her. Afraid that she'd waited so long there was nothing left to return to. She looked at the photograph. Then she prayed for the first time in years. God, I made a mess of everything. Her voice broke. I don't know whether they would even want to see me. She wiped her face. But if there's still a home for me, please show me. Lauren didn't know that 3 days later, an answer would arrive through someone she hadn't spoken to since she was 20. The message came on a Tuesday evening. Rebecca Moore. Lauren recognized the name immediately. Rebecca had been her childhood friend. They had attended church together, graduated from high school together. But after Lauren left Richmond, they'd lost contact. Rebecca had found Lauren through a mutual acquaintance. Their first conversation was cautious. They talked about work, old friends, where life had taken them. Then Rebecca asked, Have you spoken to your parents? Lauren stared at the screen. No. Minutes passed before Rebecca's next message arrived. Lauren, your mom still prays for you. Lauren read it again. Your mom still prays for you. Not prayed. Not used to pray. Still. Lauren typed. How do you know? I go to the same church. I see her almost every Sunday. Lauren's eyes filled with tears. Then she asked, How's Dad? Rebecca didn't respond immediately. Lauren watched the screen. 1 minute. 2. Then, Lauren, I'm sorry. Your dad passed away 5 years ago. Lauren stopped breathing. She read the sentence again. 5 years. Her father had been dead for 5 years. She hadn't attended his funeral, hadn't held his hand, hadn't said goodbye. She hadn't even known. Lauren dropped the phone. Abigail found her crying on the bedroom floor. Mom. Lauren pulled her daughter close. That night, she told Abigail the truth. About leaving. About the argument. About refusing to call. About her grandfather. About Margaret. Abigail listened quietly, then asked, Do you still love Grandma? Lauren nodded. Then why don't we go see her? Children sometimes ask the questions adults spend years avoiding. Lauren was afraid. But she remembered her prayer. If there's still a home for me, show me. And then Rebecca had appeared. That Friday, Lauren packed a bag. Sunday morning, she woke before sunrise. She and Abigail got into the car. The drive to Richmond took almost 3 hours. About halfway there, Lauren pulled into a gas station. I can't do this. Abigail looked at her. Why? What if she doesn't want me anymore? Abigail thought for a moment. But your friend said she still prays for you. Lauren looked at her daughter. Yes. Then maybe she's waiting. Lauren started the car and kept driving. Margaret arrived at church that Sunday like she had hundreds of Sundays before. She greeted Rebecca near the entrance. Rebecca knew Lauren was coming, but Lauren had asked her not to tell Margaret. She wasn't certain she would have the courage to walk inside. Margaret sat down, opened her Bible. The service began. At 10:43, the doors opened. Margaret turned. Lauren stood there, Abigail beside her. For a moment, Margaret didn't move. She wondered whether her mind had created what her heart had wanted for too long. Then Lauren whispered, Mom. Margaret's Bible fell to the floor. The pastor stopped speaking. Lauren began crying. Abigail looked at Margaret, then at her mother. Is that Grandma? Margaret heard her. Grandma. She had a granddaughter. Lauren took one step forward, then another. Margaret stood. There were 17 years of questions between them. Why didn't you call? Where were you? Why didn't you come home? Why did your father have to die without seeing you? Margaret could have asked every one of them. Then she remembered David. When she comes home, don't waste your time asking why she took so long. Margaret walked toward Lauren. Lauren tried to speak. Mom, I'm sorry. Margaret pulled her into her arms. Lauren collapsed against her. I'm sorry. Margaret held her tighter. I know. I wasted so much time. You're here. Dad died and I wasn't. We'll talk about Dad. Lauren sobbed. Margaret touched the back of her daughter's head. But right now, let me hold my child. 17 years disappeared into that embrace. Then Lauren stepped back. Mom, there's someone you need to meet. Abigail stood quietly beside them. This is Abigail. Margaret knelt. Abigail smiled nervously. Hi, Grandma. Margaret opened her arms. Abigail ran into them. And the woman who had spent 17 years praying for one person suddenly held two. Lauren stayed in Richmond that week. Coming home was beautiful, but restoration required more than one embrace. There were difficult conversations. Lauren told Margaret about Eric, the years of struggling, the nights she'd almost called, the shame that kept her away. Margaret told Lauren about David's illness, his final weeks, and his last request. Lauren asked, was he angry with me? Margaret shook her head. No. Lauren began crying. He should have been. He missed you. Margaret reached across the table. But he never stopped loving you. The following morning, Margaret took Lauren to David's grave. Lauren walked toward the headstone alone. She knelt in the grass. For several minutes, she said nothing. Then, I'm sorry, Dad. Margaret watched from a distance. There were consequences Grace couldn't erase. Lauren could not recover the final conversation she never had with her father. She couldn't become 21 again and choose differently. But she could decide what to do with the years still ahead. Over the following months, Lauren and Abigail visited regularly. Then Lauren found work closer to Richmond and moved back. She returned to church, not because Margaret demanded it, because Lauren wanted to rediscover the faith she'd abandoned years earlier. Margaret and Abigail became almost inseparable. They baked together, gardened together, and on Sunday mornings, Abigail often sat between Margaret and Lauren in the same church where they had been reunited. The family wasn't going backward. They were building something new. Maybe there's someone you've been praying for, someone who seems too far away. Or maybe you're the one wondering whether you've stayed away too long to come home. If this story reminds you of someone who needs hope, share it with them. And subscribe to Stories of Faith and Grace for more stories of faith, redemption, hope, and restoration. Because sometimes one story is all someone needs to believe again. That Christmas, Lauren and Abigail spent the entire week with Margaret. On Christmas Eve, Margaret went upstairs and opened Lauren's old closet. Inside were several gifts she'd kept through the years. Some were dusty. Some had wrapping paper that had faded. Lauren stood behind her. What are those? Margaret smiled. Your Christmas presents. Lauren stared at her. All of them. Not all. I eventually ran out of closet. Lauren laughed through her tears. You kept buying me gifts? Margaret picked up one of the oldest boxes. I kept thinking this might be the Christmas you came home. Lauren covered her mouth. For 17 years, she'd convinced herself there was no place waiting for her. Yet all that time, Her mother had been keeping room for her. Later that evening, Abigail fell asleep on the sofa. Lauren and Margaret sat beside the Christmas tree. For a while, neither spoke. Then Lauren said, "Mom, why didn't you give up on me?" Margaret looked at her daughter. "Because God didn't." Lauren lowered her head. Margaret continued, "I couldn't see you. I didn't know where you were. I didn't know whether my prayers were changing anything." She reached for Lauren's hand. "But I knew God could reach places I couldn't." Lauren squeezed her mother's hand. For 17 years, Margaret had prayed without seeing what was happening on the other side of those prayers. She didn't see Lauren become a mother. She didn't see the regret. She didn't see her daughter sitting on a bedroom floor asking God whether she could still come home. She didn't see Abigail discover an old photograph. She didn't know one innocent question, "Does Grandma know about me?" would finally force Lauren to face the past she'd spent 17 years avoiding. Margaret saw silence. But silence wasn't the whole story. And maybe that's what someone needs to remember today. You may not see what your prayers are doing. You may not know what is happening in the heart of the person you're praying for. You may look at the years that have passed and believe too much has been lost. Some losses are real. Some consequences cannot be undone. David didn't get those 17 years back. Lauren couldn't return to the night she left and choose different words. Restoration didn't erase their pain, but grace gave them something pain had convinced them was impossible: a new beginning. The following Sunday, Margaret walked into church with Lauren on one side and Abigail on the other. They sat together. 3 generations. One family. Not untouched by loss. Not pretending the past hadn't happened. But together. As the service began, Margaret looked toward the church doors one more time. For 17 years, she had looked at those doors wondering whether her daughter might walk through them. Now she didn't need to. Lauren reached over and took her mother's hand. Abigail took the other. Margaret smiled. The prayer she'd carried for 17 years had become the family sitting beside her. And sometimes, that's how grace arrives. Not by giving you back yesterday, but by showing you that after everything you've lost, God can still write something beautiful with tomorrow.